It is a real pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled that I had a chance to talk with some of you last night about different things going on in your aspect of animal agriculture. As you can see, I do have a little bit of a background in your area. I missed those dairy tours back. That's how I started out my career with the Dairy Council. And as they say in my world, that is probably one of the best launching pads for a nutrition professional to move on and really have some great opportunities. So I also want to say, I can tell you that I know that the subject of nutrition policy can be a real buzzkill at any party. And I sat there and thought, wow, how am I going to talk to nutrition policy to these people and make it relevant and interesting? So I hope I can do that. I position my talk in a way that will hopefully, first of all, give you an overview of who are some of the people talking about nutrition and nutrition policy. They're mostly consumer groups and consumer activists that some of you may know, some of you might not know. And then I want to really get into what specifically are they saying about food and the food industry and agriculture. And then I want to work in how the nutrition community fits into that, who are the major players in that arena, and then talk about what's going on in Washington, because that's where I am and that's where I spend most of my time. And it is a little bit of a different world than the rest of the world, so there's lots happening now on the food front. So let's first of all start talking about, look who's talking. Who are all these players? And like I said, what are they saying? They're in alphabetical order, and like I said, some of these people you probably know and have heard from. Some of them are a little new on the scene, and some of them are gaining real prominence actually in the last couple of years. So I'm going to talk about all these people specifically. First of all, Neal Barnard. How many people know Neal Barnard? If you're in the dairy industry or actually even in the meat industry, you're probably familiar with him. He is the founder of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and they're very active in the nutrition research arena and also in the food policy front. And he's president of the Cancer Project, which is a nonprofit organization advancing cancer prevention and survival through nutrition education and research. And he's one of America's leading advocates for health, nutrition, and higher standards in research. And he's principal investigator of several human clinical research trials, which he is often quoted in the media and talks about often in the press. So I just want to position this gentleman, first of all, carries an MD, which in any arena, nutrition or otherwise, is a pretty powerful credential, as you can imagine. And he actually had some run-ins at one time with the American Medical Association because of his MD, and was almost seen or heard from a couple of times speaking on behalf of all physicians. And I think they really had an issue with that at one time because he was representing positions that weren't necessarily conducive to theirs. But I wanted to just bring out a couple of quotes just to give you some idea of where this guy is coming from. One that dates a little while back. This day in the cafeteria, they were serving ribs for lunch. They looked so much like human ribs, I couldn't eat them. Within a few years, I became a vegetarian. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner. Again, that's a quote from the past, but it's still very much relevant to what this gentleman is talking about today. He's very much an advocate for vegetarian, if not even vegan diets, and doesn't believe that meat or dairy products should be served in any government-assisted program like school breakfast, lunch, after-school feeding, and the like. And here's a headline: Physicians Group responds to smear tactics by American Meat Institute and Tobacco Meat Industry Front Group, which that was, I believe, Center for Consumer Freedom. Some of you might know them. And they are an industry group, and they are very aggressive as an industry group, but they're effective in taking out ads a lot of times to call out some of the activists and really try to get underneath what it is they're about, who funds them, and what their real agenda is. And oftentimes, again, they have the banner of a health credential and some research behind them, and they've written a lot of books, and a lot of people don't really understand that they do have somewhat of an agenda. Moving on, we'll talk about Kelly Brownell. He too has been very active. You may not know him as well, but in the nutrition community, he's very strong, very recognized, and he's very active. And he also has a very big credentialed body like Yale University behind him. He's a professor of epidemiology and public health. And he's the director of the Yale Center for Eating and Weight Disorders. Interestingly, this gentleman is more of a psychologist than an MD, and he does not have a nutrition degree. But again, he's very well recognized and known to speak on nutrition issues. He's written lots of articles and books, and his whole mantra, you've probably heard or may have heard about the Twinkie tax, and he's the one that really created the whole snack tax on food to try to deter consumption. He thinks that by just subsidizing soft drinks or so-called snack foods or candy that he thinks are bad for people, that will help to deter consumption, and he thinks taking that money that you raise from taxes and putting it into some public education campaigns would help to decrease some of our obesity problem in the country. And that's probably the area where he's been the most active, is about obesity. He's also been instrumental. He just released a report, and you've probably heard this argument too, a lot of people trying to draw parallels between the food industry and the tobacco industry. And he's a big player on this front. And this report, The Perils of Ignoring History, Big Tobacco Played Dirty and Millions Died, How Similar is Big Food, was just released recently. And obviously it's not very favorable to the industry. And he argues that big food, like the food industry, products carry many of the same dangers that big tobacco did in the 1950s. And I have to tell you, there are some people out there that want nothing more than to line up CEOs of food companies or commodity groups throughout the food chain and haul them in front of Congress and be able to grill them like they did with the tobacco companies. And that was just a delight to those that did that. And so they keep plugging away, wanting to draw a parallel between, we know there's something in our food that's bad, it's causing addiction in some cases, like with sugar, and we know that you have research in your files that you're hiding from us, and we want to see it. And that's unfortunately what the tobacco industry did, and it just has really spurred on some of the activists to say, we're going to get the same thing with food. And Kelly Brownell is one of those people. Moving on, this gentleman's new to me, and also a little new on the scene. I don't know if any of you know him. He too has a PhD from Harvard, so plays very well with the press. They like those kind of credentials. And he is very strong about, anything to do with killing animals, he is anti to. And he doesn't just talk about food and nutrition, but he really plays into the whole arena of animal exploitation and experimentation. And he doesn't even like the fact that animals are in zoos or circuses or the use of leather and such in products. And I had to put this up there again to show how extreme this gentleman is. He even questions the use of hearts of palm and maple syrup, thinking about the wounds necessary to create sap. So he really buys into a very Buddhist way of thinking that we are not to live on this planet and do any harm to any living creature. And some of the things that he said, the reason I'm talking about him is because he does have a book coming out, if it's not out already, called The Face on Your Plate, The Truth About Food. And he really wants to, I don't know if the book got a great review, but it's positioning food on your plate to try to remind people that that was a living being and you should be staring at it, picturing the face that it once was. And in that book, he talks about the myth, and I've heard this a lot before in vegetarian communities, humans as hunters, people think that was our genesis and what we were supposed to be, and he says that's not true. We don't have the digestive structure, the teeth, the jaws, all of that's needed to be a carnivore. He also takes on agribusiness, saying that agribusiness is responsible for 3/4 of nitrous oxide emissions into the atmosphere. You've probably heard some of these arguments. He says 2/3 of the methane gas in the atmosphere stems from big agriculture, and he says killing animals contributes more to global warming than any other human activity. Pretty strong statement. And then he also gets into the arguments about meat is not good for human and the happiness of animals, that they matter in our lives. Next, too, new on the scene, David Murphy. Some of you might have read about him or heard about him throughout the presidential campaigns. His story is he had a fairly significant job, from what I understand, with the Labor Department in Washington, D.C., and went home to help his sister, who has a small farm in Iowa, And she had said that she needed his help because there was supposed to be I believe, a fairly good-sized hog farm moving in close to her property. And so he went to help her fight that, and he stayed. He got energized by developing grassroots efforts, I think, to fight big business, big agribusiness, so to speak. And he's the founder and director of Food Democracy Now!, which is his grassroots movement. And he has support from farmers, writers, chefs, and policy advocates who recognize that there's a sense of urgency in creating a new food system, and that system needs to be capable of meeting the changing needs of American society as it relates to food health, animal welfare, and the environment. And he was very strong in starting a petition process, again, a grassroots process, and got about 89,000 signatures, I believe, to submit to the administration to recommend some cabinet-level positions that they thought, they wanted to recommend some people for the positions. And they don't know that they can take claim for some of them that have been appointed, but some of them that have been appointed so far within USDA were on their list of people to select. So again, just somebody to watch. He's newer on the scene than some of the other ones that I'm talking about today, like Marion Nestle, who's been around for quite some time. And I've know Marion very well, served on panels with her, and spoken with her personally many times, as some of these others. She's a professor at NYU, and she's written a book called Food Politics: How the Food Industry Influences Nutrition and Health. And she's everywhere. She's got her platform at NYU. She's very active in the media, often quoted in many articles that talk about either organic or sustainable food or just health issues in general. And sometimes she's pretty moderate, sounds reasonable as a nutrition professor, and sometimes she's pretty strong in her views, like in her book, where she just doesn't believe that industry is not corrupting the regulatory process in some way. So she's often beating that drum, saying that there's no way that industry isn't affecting this process. One of her mantras, too, she's also very active on the obesity front and is very tied into Kelly Brownell and the Center for Science in the Public Interest, which I didn't put up here, by the way, because I figure we hear so much about them. I thought we'd talk about some new players in this arena. But she's very connected to all of those groups and talks a lot about obesity and the fact that food companies and the food industry and food business, agribusiness, all they want to do is produce more food, get people to eat more food, because that's how they make money. And that's one of her biggest mantras, is the industry wants you to eat more. Therefore, that's one of the causes of obesity in our country. Next, Michael Pollan, really gaining a lot of stature in the last couple of years. He's a New York Times columnist, has been a journalist, as far as I know, all of his life, and a good one at that, but he's really taken on this issue of our food supply. And he, too, now has jumped on the bandwagon of trying to look at, how agribusiness is hurting our health, how government policies need to be changed, how the whole food supply needs to be revamped. And he's gotten huge attention and press through the two books that he's written, The Omnivore's Dilemma. I don't know if any of you have read either of these, and the next one is In Defense of Food. And some of his mantra is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And he really has this very bucolic view of what our food supply should be and what our diets should look like. And he often talks about, go back to what your grandmother told you, and probably what she told you was the advice that you should be adhering to this day. He really talks about, don't eat anything, like I said, that your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. I'm not sure what we're eating today that isn't recognized as food. Choose food over food-like substances. He's very against anything that is so-called manufactured with vitamins added, with nutrients that say, I'm just using this as an example. He hasn't said this, but I'm thinking orange juice with vitamin C and D added. He thinks is probably not a good idea. Just squeeze the oranges yourself and drink the juice. And he gets into these myths about food as a delivery vehicle for nutrients. He's really taken on the nutrition community in a lot of his public talks and even in his books. And he's even taken on dietitians to say that, we are part of the culprit and reason that people nitpick food too much and break it way down into nutrients instead of looking at food as a whole. And he's coined the term nutritionism, and he uses that a lot, either in his books or in his talks, again, to say, we're obsessed, which I tend to agree a little bit with him, is that we are obsessed with food as a country, but we're not looking at it in probably a holistic enough view. Sometimes we do break it down too much by if it's a carbohydrate, if it's got too much fat, if it has vitamin C. I mean, we don't look at it as a whole. We try to just narrow down into one nutrient, which he really doesn't agree with. And he says that, he doesn't also believe that there are evil foods or good foods. And again, it's that argument I just said, that we really shouldn't look at food just for its saturated fat content. We need to look at how it was grown, what it did to the environment, how it affects our health. Eric Schlosser, I'm sure a lot of you know Eric Schlosser. He's been at it also for a really long time. His claim to fame really is the book of Fast Food Nation. It got huge press. It was so popular that I understand in some colleges and high schools it's required reading, which is a problem, as you can imagine, because he really, too, is trying to paint this dark picture of the fast food industry, and he gets into meat production and processing plants, and again, is not a very favorable picture to how food gets to our plate. I will talk about Food Inc. in a minute, but he was very instrumental in putting this movie together. His second book, by the way, I didn't mention here, is called Best Food Nation, and that was geared at kids. And he had a whole campaign running about a year and a half, I believe, ago, that was going to release this book into schools. It gave teachers lesson plans and kind of, a whole discussion point to use when talking about this book in the classroom. And it got a little bit of some dander up, as you can imagine, amongst different segments of the food supply. And he again really helped galvanize interest in the politics and ecology of food production, and he started a lot of the discussion about that. He also brought forth labor issues as essential concern for the sustainable food movement. Now, Alice Waters. I'm sure, I can't imagine you're in the United States right now and don't know Alice Waters' name. If you don't, she too is gaining huge national prominence. She has been an advocate for years and years and years. She started her restaurant, Chez Panay, in Berkeley when she was 27 years old. She's now in her early 60s. So that just gives you some idea that she's been at this for quite a long time. But she's really gained huge prominence, probably in the last few years. She's also a strong advocate for farmers markets and for sound, sustainable agriculture. She talks about organic a lot. She's written books. She was just on 60 Minutes, which got huge press. I mean, it was flying around the internet, and on all my listservs, people, sending around links to the interview and some of her quotes that she made. And here's a quote I thought that was relevant by Gavin Newsom, the mayor of San Francisco. She has, I think, done more to change our eating habits for the better than anyone in the United States of America. That's a pretty strong statement. She also convinced him to let her organize a slow food festival outside of City Hall in San Francisco, which he gave her approval to do last September, and it was wildly successful. So I'm telling you this because there is a huge movement out there, even though that's in San Francisco and California, and people think that's a different part of the world. Often what we see happen in California makes its way east eventually, or even in the Midwest. She also, and as you see here, there were 85,000 attendees to her Slow Food Festival, like I said, last September. She also started what is called the Edible Schoolyard. She's been instrumental in creating the concept that kids need to be closer to understanding how food is grown, planted, harvested. Not a bad thing. And she thinks that this will help improve their diets and nutrition in schools. She is on a mission, I believe, to try to have a garden associated with almost every school in the country. And she's made some progress so far, at least in her area. This is just a picture of you can't really see it in color, but this is a picture of what she's done. I think this was not near the Capitol. That can't be. It's an example of one of her gardens that she's developed that is associated with the school. Okay, now Food Inc. How many people have heard of this movie, Food Inc.? Anybody? Good. It's a big deal. From what I understand, it's got huge backing. Lots of money and resources have been put into the development of this movie. And we've seen movies in the past, I've seen them in the past, talking about similar concepts that are going to be laid out in this film. But for instance, for some reason, this, like I said, has some strong supporters, and this is, we've got some people behind this movie that really want to affect and change policy. The filmmaker Robert Kenner is apparently well known, and he is supposed to be lifting the veil on the food industry, exposing the highly mechanized underbelly that's been hidden from the American consumer with the consent of our government's regulatory agencies, USDA and FDA. So, as you can see, there's that notion, too, that the food supply is corrupted by industry and that government is involved in that. They're going to say that this is all controlled by a handful of corporations, which is supposed to be a bad thing. And as I mentioned, Eric Schlosser and Michael Pollan had very much to do with this movie. They're interviewed in it, and I think they were both even producers. Okay, I'm running out of time here. Real quick on the nutrition front, the American Dietetic Association, you probably know, is one of the, well, is the leading association or member association of dietetics professionals in the country, probably 70,000 dietitians in this organization. And I wanted to tell you about a couple of subsets of ADA. One is called the Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Practice Group. This is a group that's been developed over the years. The members lead the future in sustainable and accessible food and water systems through dietetics education, research, and action. They're very vocal and strong in their views about organic and sustainable agriculture. And I hate to say it, it's a subset of my association I belong to. They're not always talking about sound science in their recommendations and policies. I'm going to skip through some of this. I just wanted to list some of these for you to understand who's kind of leading out there talking about nutrition. But now with Washington, a couple of major things going on the nutrition front. And the reason I'm putting the people first and Washington last is because a lot of the characters or people that I just talked to you about are very much trying to affect all of these kinds of things that are going on in D.C. right now. We are in the throes of the Child Nutrition and WIC Reauthorization Act. This is required to be reviewed every 4 years. So it's in the works right now. It has to be either reauthorized by September or extended. I'm hearing in the halls of Congress that there might not be enough budget to get it fully reauthorized in the way that people want, so it might just be extended as it is now, and we'll continue the debate through next year. But what that does is it reauthorizes, or it's the bill that is put forward to address school feeding programs, breakfast, lunch, after school, summer feeding. There's lots of congressional hearings going on right now. I think one as we speak is happening in the Senate Ag Committee. Last week there was a House Ag Committee on obesity. Lots of interest on agriculture, on nutrition, on obesity, on organic and sustainable type stuff. This is just cropping up in all different ways. And I listed the people here underneath who are very active on these different issues. The dietary guidelines is huge. It sets policy for everything else that the government does on nutrition. So the dietary guidelines are required to be reviewed every 5 years. We're in the cycle of the 5th year, so we have a committee that's been developed or selected. They've had 2 meetings so far. They will deliberate throughout the year and then put forth the new guidelines for 2010. When that happens, everything else is supposed to change and meet the new guidelines. It takes a long time for government to do that, but it's a really important process, and everybody's involved in it. It's a big food fest. At these meetings, it's a big who's who in the industry, nutrition, government, communities. It brings everybody together. Some of the big issues being debated there, by the way, are going to be sodium is really gaining prominence. It might be important for some of your products down the line. Definitely obesity is kind of an overarching issue that really takes center stage on a lot of the discussions. Farm policy, again, I mentioned the people here that are trying to really pay attention to farm policy. Health reform is a really big issue this year, as you've probably already heard the administration talking about. And ADA, I think they should have done this a long time ago. Finally, they're stepping up, saying prevention is the key. We need to look at prevention. And if we want to look at our health reform, that has to be a cornerstone of it. So that's one of their mantras for the year. We talked about the cabinet, and I talked about sodium. The one thing I want to mention, the reason I put this picture in, and I didn't mention it with Alice Waters, and why she's gaining such ground, she's very connected to this administration, and as a matter of fact, was very instrumental. If you don't know it already, they've already planted an organic garden on the White House lawn. And as you see, our First Lady there helping out with the first dig. So it's a whole new day. That's very significant, and from what I understand, USDA is going to follow suit and probably have some kind of garden like that on their lawn as well.